Li Chen had never been particularly good with birds. Or rather, he hadn't been good at taking pictures of them. People, yes, they posed, they smiled, they understood what he was trying to do. But birds? They were just impossible. So, when he found himself hunched over his camera on the dusty street outside his small photography studio, desperately trying to snap a picture of a pigeon that was simply refusing to cooperate, he couldn't help but mutter under his breath, "This is the universe's punishment for all my creative decisions." The pigeon, a scraggly thing that probably belonged to a local urban flock with a questionable reputation, stared back at him with its beady little eyes. Its wings were tense as it puffed up its chest in defiance. Li Chen sighed. The camera was poised, the lens focused, the shutter button half-pressed, but it wouldn't budge. The damn pigeon wasn't going anywhere. The truth was, Li Chen didn't really like pigeons. He found them ungrateful, ugly, and loud. But they were everywhere in the city, and if he wanted to be a photographer of life, as he liked to call himself, he had to accept them. They were a part of the landscape. He'd even tried using them as subjects for his portfolio, but every time he caught a photo that looked promising, the bird would fly off at the last second. At this point, he was starting to think they were in on the joke. A few feet away, a flurry of footsteps interrupted his thoughts. His neighbor, Mr. Huang, a retired architect who had taken to spending his days in a noisy lawn chair watching the world go by, leaned out of his window and waved. "I see you're still chasing that pigeon, Li." Li Chen gave him a look, but Mr. Huang's comment didn't sting. It never did. The old man was always good for a laugh, even if it was at his expense. "Maybe the pigeon is too smart for you," Mr. Huang added with a grin. "You need to learn some tricks from the birds. They fly when they see danger." Li Chen rolled his eyes. "You've been reading too many bird-watching books, Mr. Huang. I'm not chasing the pigeon. I'm capturing the essence of urban life." "Urban life," Mr. Huang repeated, "or urban failure?" "Ha, ha," Li Chen said, but he was already turning his attention back to the pigeon. That's when it happened. A strange, almost imperceptible hum filled the air, like the sudden presence of static electricity before a lightning strike. Li Chen looked up, confused. The bright sky above was cloudless, the cityscape stretching out in every direction. But the sound, it wasn't just in his head. It grew louder, a strange, mechanical thrum that was definitely not of this world. Before he could process what was happening, a sharp beam of intense light shot down from the sky. It was like a laser beam, concentrated and purposeful, with no apparent origin. The light struck him square in the chest, searing his vision with a white-hot burst of radiance. He gasped, his breath knocked from him as his body involuntarily arched back. Everything around him vanished, the street, the buildings, the people, the damn pigeon, and for a moment, he was floating in a sea of brightness. His skin felt like it was being tugged apart, as if he were being both torn apart and remade. The world went completely silent for an instant. Then, it was gone. The light faded, leaving nothing behind but a faint, almost imperceptible afterimage in his vision, like the ghost of the sun. Li Chen blinked. He was still standing on the sidewalk, still holding his camera, and still dressed in his usual frumpy black hoodie and jeans. But something felt different. His hands were shaking. Then he noticed the marbles. A jar of marbles that had been sitting on his workbench in the studio had rolled across the floor and spilled out onto the street in a cascade of colorful glass orbs. Without thinking, he reached out a hand toward them, half expecting to feel the usual clink of smooth glass against his fingers. Except this time, the marbles hovered, defying gravity. Li Chen's heart skipped a beat. His fingers, still extended toward them, trembled with disbelief. The marbles floated in midair, rotating slowly, held aloft by some invisible force. He moved his hands slightly, and the marbles followed, obediently turning and spinning as if they were a part of his own body. He withdrew his hand, and the marbles slowly came to a rest on the ground. He stood there for a moment, his breath shallow, his mind trying to catch up with what his eyes were telling him. "Okay, now I'm freaking out," he muttered to himself. He wasn't sure what had just happened. Maybe it was a freak accident, or some kind of malfunction in his brain from the light. Maybe he was hallucinating. Or maybe something had changed. He shook his head. It was impossible, of course. But then again, just moments ago, he was trying to take a photograph of an elusive pigeon, and now he was bending light with his hand like it was nothing. All right, he said aloud, trying to calm himself down. Just breathe. Take a second. He closed his eyes, then reopened them, but the marbles remained still on the ground. A light breeze kicked up, swirling through the alley, and the soft rattle of the world returned. But everything felt different, sharper somehow. More vibrant. More alive. Li Chen reached for his camera again, feeling suddenly emboldened. Maybe this wasn't just a fluke. He could try something else. Something small. He pointed the camera at a nearby lamppost. The old fixture looked ordinary enough, but with the strange sense of possibility he now felt, he focused on it, not through the lens, but with his own mind. He willed it to glow. To his astonishment, it did. The light around the lamppost flared into an ethereal glow, brighter than anything that should have been possible. He stepped closer, and the lamppost shimmered like a faint illusion. A smile tugged at the corner of his lips. The power, whatever it was there. He could control it. It was like magic. But there was something more than magic in the air now. The world had changed, and he was just beginning to understand that he had changed with it. Li Chen stood in the middle of the alleyway, his fingers twitching slightly as he looked at the lamppost, which was still glowing faintly. His mind raced, his heart pounding with excitement and disbelief. He had no idea what had just happened, or why, but the raw possibility in the air made his pulse quicken. The possibilities, he could feel them, like 1,000 threads waiting to be woven into something far more magnificent than his wildest dreams. The lamppost flickered, a few sparks dancing around its base, as if it were suddenly uncertain of its own reality. Li Chen stretched his hand out again, more deliberately this time, and the light from the lamppost pulsed to life in response, growing brighter, until the whole street was bathed in an almost unnatural radiance. He stepped back and blinked, his jaw hanging open. His breath quickened. This wasn't just light, it was alive. He could manipulate it. With a nervous laugh, Li Chen swiped his hand through the beam, splitting it into multiple strands that curved and spiraled into the air. Each beam wove into a glowing ribbon, dancing like fireflies. He felt drunk on the power, like a child discovering a secret game that no one else knew how to play. His gaze shifted to the ground, where the scattered marbles still lay. Without thinking, he waved his hand over them, and they leapt back into the air, floating once again. But this time, they moved with purpose, forming a perfect circle in the air before him. The spectacle felt like a dream, like he was the god of light, shaping the world with nothing but the flick of a wrist. He could feel his pulse in his fingertips. He had control. It was intoxicating. For the next several hours, he did nothing but experiment, exploring the vast, uncharted territory of his newfound power. He wove beams of light into intricate shapes and patterns, illuminating the alley in colors that had never existed before. He created illusions, a dragon made entirely of glowing strands, weaving around the street lamps, its body flickering in and out of existence like a mirage. People walking by paused, staring in wonder, their faces lit up with awe as they caught sight of the spectacle. But Li Chen wasn't paying attention to their reactions. He was lost in the magic. It was a rush unlike anything he had ever experienced, better than any photograph, better than any shot he had ever tried to capture. This was beyond art. This was creation. It wasn't long before he realized that the effect was spreading, that his illusions were bleeding into reality in ways he hadn't intended. He'd intended to make a glowing heart for a couple walking by, something sweet and harmless. But when the heart flickered into being, it didn't stay where he'd projected it. It expanded, growing larger and brighter, stretching to the size of a small building. It hung suspended in midair, casting shifting, colorful shadows on the pavement. The couple stopped, their eyes wide with wonder, and for a moment, everything felt perfect. But then the heart pulsed, flashing rapidly between colors, the intensity growing, until the entire street around them seemed to fade away, swallowed by the light. The couple stumbled backward, their hands outstretched, their faces contorted with confusion. It was too much. Li Chen snapped his fingers, and the heart vanished, but the illusion didn't go away right away. The couple continued to stand there, blinking as though they couldn't shake the dreamlike atmosphere. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. Control, he reminded himself. You need control. He couldn't let the power get away from him like this. Not yet. Not when it felt so good to wield it. But it was too late. That night, for the first time in weeks, Li Chen didn't sleep. Instead, he spent hours experimenting with his newfound gift, testing limits, finding boundaries that weren't there. He called in sick to the photography studio the next day, needing to focus on what he had discovered. His mind swirled with possibilities. He started small, just bending light around objects, distorting their shapes. A can of soda on the kitchen counter bent in strange, impossible ways, the light refracting around it like some sort of magical optical illusion. But then his gaze drifted outside his apartment window, toward the city skyline. A sudden impulse hit him, and before he could think better of it, he lifted his hand, feeling the energy coalesce between his fingers. The skyline responded. A massive, shimmering cityscape stretched up from the ground, complete with sparkling towers, wide avenues, and trees made of glowing glass. It was a city out of a dream. At first, it was only a faint glow, but the longer he focused, the sharper the edges became, and soon, a perfect replica of the city stood before him, a shimmering illusion. He could feel it pulling him, almost like he could walk into it, like he could step right through the window and be lost inside this world of light. But it was too much. The feeling of detachment that came over him was like a punch to the gut. For a moment, he saw himself standing in his small, cluttered apartment, alone. But then, there was something else, another version of himself, walking through the light city he had created. It was as though he had two lives, one here in the real world and one in the fabricated, shimmering place he had crafted with his mind. The real world felt like it was slipping away, like a movie playing in the background of a dream. He snapped out of it, gasping for air, the light city vanishing in a burst of shimmering light. His hand was still extended, as if the illusion had been too close to him, too real. He stared at the spot where the city had stood, feeling the faint echo of it still in his mind, as if it hadn't truly disappeared at all. That's when the first pang of fear hit him. What if it's already too much? He shook the thought away. This was just the beginning. He was still in control. The next few days blurred together as he dove deeper into the illusions, testing the limits of his power. The light was no longer just about shapes and patterns, it became about people, too. He started creating entire scenarios, staging little moments where people seemed to interact with the fantasy world he conjured. A boy and girl sitting on a bench surrounded by floating flowers. A businessman strolling through a forest made of glowing trees. The joy of creation consumed him. But the more he played with it, the more he noticed something strange. At first, the people didn't seem to notice that they were part of his illusions. They were just there. He was giving them something, hope, beauty, a break from the gray world they lived in. But then one night, when he was walking back to his apartment, he saw a figure standing near the alley entrance, just out of the corner of his eye. It was an old woman, hunched over and mumbling to herself. Li Chen ignored her at first. After all, she wasn't part of the illusion. But as he walked past her, something stopped him. The woman was staring directly at him, her eyes wide. "You can see me, can't you?" she asked, her voice cracked and thin. Li Chen froze. For a moment, he didn't know what to say. She wasn't real. She couldn't be. "You're not real," he said, almost a whisper, not sure if he was speaking to himself or to her. But the woman nodded slowly, a wisp of a smile crossing her lips. "You're not the only one who can make illusions, boy." Before he could react, the woman vanished into the shadows, leaving Li Chen standing there in the street, his mind racing. The glow of his own illusions seemed to flicker in his vision, as if the world itself was pushing back. Li Chen stood frozen in the alleyway, the echoes of the woman's voice still hanging in the air like the fading trail of a phantom. "You're not the only one who can make illusions, boy." The words repeated in his head, over and over, like the rhythmic pulse of an approaching storm. He glanced around, half expecting the woman to reappear from the shadows, but there was nothing. No trace of her. Just the quiet hum of the city, the distant murmur of traffic, and the familiar lights flickering in the distance. It should have been a moment of relief. After all, she wasn't real. He knew that. He could create whatever he wanted now. He had the power. But somehow, the encounter unsettled him more than anything else. There was something in her eyes, something ancient and knowing. She had looked at him like she understood. Like she knew what he was doing. What he was becoming. He tried to shake off the feeling. The woman was a figment, just another ghost in the alley. He was the one with power now. The light was his to command. He would just need to focus. But the shadows of the city, the ones he had so carefully illuminated with his new abilities, felt different. They felt darker. He couldn't explain it. He was starting to sense things that weren't there. Small things, fleeting things, movements at the corner of his vision, whispers in the air, the light flickering in unnatural ways. He dismissed it as exhaustion. He hadn't slept in days, after all. The magic was keeping him awake. He should have gone home. He should have returned to the safety of his apartment, where everything was familiar and where he could bury himself in more illusions. But instead, he found himself walking, almost absent-mindedly, to the center of the city, toward the heart of the district. Toward the crowds. Toward the noise. The streets were busy, as usual, and people rushed past him, their eyes glued to their phones or to each other, oblivious to the world of wonder that had just opened up around them. He could create whatever he wanted, make the world bend to his will. 1,000 glowing lights. 1,000 moments of beauty. But today, something felt different. Today, the light felt too sharp, too harsh. His illusions felt less like the magic he had created and more like something that was holding him back. The more he tried to create, the more he felt himself slipping, like a puppet whose strings were becoming tangled. He stopped at the edge of the square, his feet suddenly feeling heavy, his body stiff. In the crowd, no one noticed. They were all too consumed by their own lives. But Li Chen felt it, the weight of the world pressing in on him, a crushing sense of disconnection. Was this all he was now? An architect of illusions, pulling at the strings of reality, shaping the world in his own image? The thought made him dizzy. His head spun, and before he knew it, the words of the old woman echoed back in his mind, "You're not the only one who can make illusions." A sharp pang of fear shot through him. Could she have been right? Was he the only one? Was he the only one creating these things? Was he the only one who had power over light? The more he thought about it, the more he realized that the power had begun to feel uncontrollable. He had started small, making simple shapes and lights. But now, his illusions were growing more complex, more intricate. The more he created, the more they bled into the world around him, until he couldn't tell where the illusion ended and reality began. Suddenly, the light overhead began to pulse, flickering in a way that Li Chen had never seen before. It was as if the world was blinking in and out of existence. His fingers twitched, and without thinking, he reached up to steady the flickering light, willing it to stay. But the more he focused, the more unstable it became. The beams of light crackled and hissed, twisting around him like the threads of some monstrous spider's web. His heart raced as he tried to pull the light back, to bring it under control, but the harder he pulled, the more chaotic it became. A burst of color exploded in the sky above him, bright reds and blues spiraling like a burst of fireworks, disorienting him. "Li Chen," a voice called from the crowd. He turned, startled, and saw a familiar face pushing through the throng. It was Mia, one of the few people he hadn't yet distanced himself from in his recent obsession. She looked concerned, her brow furrowed as she approached. "What's going on? Are you all right?" Li Chen blinked, as if coming out of a trance. He wiped his forehead, the sweat beading on his skin. "Yeah, I'm fine," he said, though his voice was strained. "Just a little too much light today." Mia raised an eyebrow. "You've been acting weird, Li. You've been disappearing for days, showing up at odd hours. People are starting to talk." His chest tightened. He didn't want to explain. He didn't want to admit that something had gone wrong, that his own creations were starting to haunt him. But he couldn't lie to her, not entirely. "I've been working on some new projects," he said, his voice shaking. "I guess I got a little carried away." Mia stepped closer, her eyes narrowing. "I can tell. Your eyes are wild. You look like you haven't slept in days. Whatever this is, it's not good for you." The pulse of light overhead suddenly grew more intense, flaring as though reacting to his emotions, like it was alive. His body stiffened in fear. The power wasn't his to control anymore. It was controlling him. He could feel it in every fiber of his being, the pull of the illusion, the hunger, the endless desire to create, to escape. Mia's voice cut through his haze. "Li, you have to stop. Whatever you're doing, it's taking over you." The world flickered again, and in that brief moment of distortion, Li Chen saw something he hadn't expected. It wasn't just the city or the street that warped before him, it was his own face, reflected in the shattered glass of a nearby storefront. His image flickered in the reflection, his features twisted, as though the very act of creating was fracturing his sense of self. The fear in his chest surged. He stepped backward, his body moving without thinking. His power was spiraling out of control. He wasn't sure where the illusion ended anymore. He wasn't sure if there even was an illusion. Mia reached for him, her hand gentle on his arm. "Li, listen to me. You're losing yourself. You need help." But all Li Chen could hear was the hum, the constant, suffocating hum of the light he had unleashed. His vision was blurring, the world swirling in a haze of shimmering colors. The cracks were starting to show. Reality was bending, stretching like a rubber band on the verge of snapping. And in the distance, he heard the faint whisper of the old woman's voice again. "You're not the only one who can make illusions." And then, with a final pulse of light, everything went black. The darkness didn't come all at once. First, there was the hum, the disorienting, mechanical buzz of electricity, buzzing like a hive in his bones. Then, the light flickered out, swallowed up by the blackness. Li Chen felt the world he had built, the world he had controlled, unraveling like thread pulled from the seams of a fraying garment. When his vision returned, it wasn't to the sharp, bright world he knew. It was something else entirely. He blinked. He wasn't sure if his eyes were still adjusting or if he had slipped entirely out of the real world. His hands felt strange, weightless. His body was floating, as if gravity itself had decided to take a break. The light. It was everywhere. But not the kind of light that he could control, the one he had bent and shaped. No, this was something deeper, something ancient. He felt it in his skin, like a pulse beneath the surface, throbbing through the air, filling the space. He tried to reach for it, but the more he grasped, the more it slipped away, like water through his fingers. The hum returned. Louder now, shaking the air around him. He was no longer standing on the city streets. The skyline, the bustling people, the sounds of traffic, all of it had vanished. He was in a vast, infinite expanse of light, surrounded by shifting colors that morphed and pulsed like the aurora borealis. It was beautiful, breathtaking, but it made his stomach churn. He tried to call out, but his voice was swallowed up by the endless hum. Panic began to creep in, a cold, sharp edge pressing against his chest. What was happening? A figure appeared in the distance, barely visible at first, but then becoming clearer as it moved toward him. It was a woman, no, more like a shadow of a woman, her form flickering in and out like a broken hologram. The same old woman from the alley. She moved closer, her face unreadable, her eyes dark pools of endless depth. Her lips didn't move, but the words came anyway, ringing in his ears like a distant bell. "You're not the only one who can make illusions." Li Chen opened his mouth to speak, to ask what she meant, but his voice was strangled, caught somewhere between the blackness and the light. The world around him twisted, the vibrant colors pulsing, swirling like a whirlpool, threatening to pull him in. "This isn't what you think it is," the woman's voice echoed, and the air around him seemed to vibrate with the force of her words. "You've opened a door, Li Chen, but you don't understand what you've let through." His heart pounded in his chest, a frantic rhythm that matched the pulsing of the light. "What door?" he managed to croak, though it felt like the words were being torn from him by the pressure of the air. "The door to the other side. The one where light doesn't bend to your will. The one that bends you." The words hit him like a slap. He stumbled backward, trying to hold on to something, anything, but the ground beneath his feet seemed to dissolve, leaving him floating in the endless sea of light. "You're not the first," the woman continued, her figure flickering like a flame about to be extinguished. "There have been others like you. Others who thought they could control the light. But the light isn't something to control, Li Chen. It's a force of its own. And you've awakened it." He shook his head, unable to fully comprehend what she was saying. "What do you want from me?" His voice cracked, desperate now. He wasn't sure if she could hear him, but the hum of the world seemed to pulse in time with his fear. The woman didn't answer immediately. Instead, she stepped forward, the light bending around her, casting long, shifting shadows across the void. "I'm not here to want anything from you," she said softly, almost pityingly. "I'm here to show you what you've become. To show you what you're about to lose." Suddenly, everything went silent. The hum, the pulsing light, the pressure on his chest, everything ceased in an instant. It was as if the world itself held its breath. Li Chen opened his eyes. The light was gone. The blackness, too. Instead, he was back in his apartment, the familiar hum of the city outside the window. The sound of traffic, the chatter of voices in the street, the usual dull buzz of reality. It felt wrong. He staggered to his feet, reaching out for something to hold on to. His apartment, his desk, his camera, all of it was there, exactly as it had been when he last saw it. But something was different. The air felt thick, suffocating. The colors of the room, the furniture, the paintings on the walls, they seemed muted, faded. His vision swam in and out of focus, as if reality itself was glitching. And then it hit him, he could still feel the light. It wasn't gone. It was inside him now. Beneath his skin, in the marrow of his bones. It was suffocating him, pressing on him from the inside. It wasn't a gift anymore. It was a prison. He pressed his hands to his head, trying to clear his thoughts. What was real? Was this the real world? Or was it another illusion he had conjured? No, he thought, shaking his head. This is real. I'm real. But the woman's words echoed in his mind, you've awakened it. He glanced at the window. The city outside seemed to stretch and distort, like a mirage. The buildings bent, the streets rippled, as though the fabric of reality itself was being twisted by the light inside him. His pulse quickened. He stumbled back, collapsing onto the couch. His hands trembled as they grasped at the armrests. His heart pounded louder in his ears, matching the frantic beat of the pulsing light inside him. "Make it stop," he whispered, but no one answered. He tried to focus, to rein the power back in, but it was like trying to catch smoke with his bare hands. The light swirled within him, growing more intense, more chaotic. Then, there was a knock at the door. He froze. The last time he'd heard a knock on that door, it had been Mia. She'd been worried about him. She'd tried to reach him. But now, the world was warping, and he wasn't sure if Mia was part of the illusion or not. "Lee," a voice called from the other side. It was Mia's voice, soft and concerned. Lee Chen swallowed, trying to steady his breath. He pushed himself to his feet, his body heavy with the weight of the light inside him. He couldn't let it take him. He couldn't let it destroy everything. The knock came again, louder this time, followed by a soft rattle of the doorknob. "Lee, open the door." He staggered toward the door, each step feeling like it took everything out of him. The world was pulsing around him, bending and twisting, and all he wanted was for it to stop. But as he reached for the doorknob, the light flared again, and the entire apartment seemed to shake. The walls cracked. The ceiling split. And in the chaos, everything went dark again.